Everybody's got a theory when it comes to the game of poker. Does it ever seem like you sit down to a table full of experts? Everybody's got advice for you. Everybody tells you what you should and shouldn't be doing. I have to admit, as a self-proclaimed poker guru, I am often guilty of this myself. I'm Steve Wannall. Welcome to the Tavern Poker Podcast. On this episode, we're going to be talking about systems, but not just any system, specifically Game Theory Optimal. Now, lately, Game Theory Optimal, or GTO, as it's referred to in the shorthand, has been the subject of a little bit of controversy, namely from people who believe that it is what we call exploitable, and exploitative poker play is being discussed as an alternative or a counter to GTO. But what exactly is GTO, and how did it become so popular in the first place? Well, that's what we're here to discuss. Now, I think one of the reasons that people have started to explain that it is exploitable is that people tend to try and find a system that will break the game. This is true of any game, really, especially something that involves wagering, something where you can earn a whole lot of money for a little bit of work. If there's a promise of some kind of a payday for playing a game, then people are always going to try and find some foolproof system to beat the game. The problem is, with a great many games, and poker in particular, there is no one system that's foolproof. But that very idea exists in the DNA of Game Theory Optimal. So what is Game Theory Optimal? Well, it's obviously based on a branch of mathematics called game theory. Now, math is hard. We all know this to be true. And while there are a lot of people who love applying math to games, and poker in particular, there are a great many of us who just don't have the patience or the brain power to exert on it. So game theory sort of exists as a way to break it down into its base components and do something that really poker is all about, which is to give us options. So I'm going to try and explain game theory to you in the simplest terms I possibly can. And instead of using numbers, I'm going to tell you a story. Specifically the story of the hare and the stag. Now this might sound like some old parable like the tortoise and the hare, but no, it's completely different. The Hare and the Stag is a typical story that's used to try and explain basic game theory. And it goes something like this. Imagine you are in a hunting lodge. A big, huge mansion on a massive rolling estate that takes up several hundred acres of woodland. And it exists simply to hunt. And what you're hunting on this property is either hare or stag, or if it's easier for you, rabbits and deer. Now, you're not just a trophy hunter in this parable, you are actually hunting for meat to feed yourself or your family or whatever. And in order to prepare for the hunt, you have a room that is all to yourself. A room that is specifically there for you to prepare to hunt one of these two game animals. And you can only hunt for one of them. So in this room, you have to decide how to prepare yourself. Do you grab the tools to hunt the hare, or do you grab what you need to hunt the stag? Well, that's the first choice you're presented with, and the choice is all yours, but there is a catch. You see, you're not the only hunter. There's another hunter, and they have their own room in a completely separate portion of this mansion, and they are also deciding what they should hunt, either the hare or the stag. Now here's where it becomes tricky. If you decide to hunt the hare, that's pretty easy. It only takes one hunter to catch a hare. But in order to take down the stag, it's going to require two of you. No one hunter can capture a stag on their own. And herein lies the dilemma. You don't know what the other hunter is preparing to hunt, and they don't know what you're preparing to hunt. And making this choice is going to be important, because what you take home from the hunt is entirely determined by it. So if the two of you decide to hunt the same animal, you're going to catch it, but you're going to split the spoils of the hunt. So let's try and quantify that a little bit. Let's break the game animals down into specific units to make it easier to track. For the sake of argument, let's say that a hare is worth 4 units of meat. And you can decide what a unit is. It's pounds or a couple pounds, whatever. It's 4 units of meat. Whereas a stag is worth a whopping 12 units of meat. 3 times as much as the hare. Now, knowing that is what you stand to gain, and the fact that you can only prepare to hunt one of these animals, and the other hunter is also preparing to hunt one of these animals, and neither one of you knows what the other is preparing to hunt, that leaves you with exactly 4 possible outcomes from your choices. And they are as follows. 1. both of you choose to hunt the stag. Now, since it will take two of you to capture the stag, and you've both decided to hunt it, you will be successful. You'll capture the stag, and each of you will split the 12 units of meat and go home with 6 units apiece. This is the best possible outcome for you. Then there's number 2. In this scenario, both of you choose to prepare to hunt the hare. Now, it only takes one of you to hunt the hare, so this will be pretty easy. You'll capture it, but you're also going to have to split the meat from the hare. A hare is only worth 4 units of meat, which means each of you would walk away with only 2 units of meat. Not nearly as much as walking away with the 6 units of meat if you both hunt the stag, but at least it's still a positive outcome. Then there's possibility number 3. That's where you decide to hunt the hare, and the other hunter decides to hunt the stag. Now, this is a pretty good outcome for you because it only takes one of you to catch a hare, and you're the only one prepared to catch it. In that scenario, you are going to walk away with 4 units of meat all to yourself, and the other hunter will go home empty-handed. And then, of course, there's possibility 4, which is the exact opposite of 3. The other hunter prepares to hunt the hare, and you prepare to hunt the stag, in which case the other hunter will go home with 4 units of meat, and you will go home with absolutely nothing, which is the worst-case scenario for you. So that's it. That's all 4 things that could possibly happen. And based on that knowledge, what do you choose to do? This is the heart of game theory, figuring out that decision. Now, at a first glance, it would appear that the obvious choice is to hunt the stag. After all, if both of you choose to hunt the stag, you stand the most to gain. It is the best possible outcome, and why wouldn't anybody try and go for the best possible outcome? That seems logical, right? Well, there's one small problem with that. You don't know what the other hunter is going to do. Now, you can assume that they are also going to prepare to hunt the stag, but you don't actually know that's what they're going to do. Even if that's the thing that makes the most sense to you, even if that is the most logical, obvious choice in your mind, you still can't control what the other hunter is going to choose. And if they choose to hunt the hare, it generates your worst possible outcome, which is that you walk away with nothing. So this is the choice that we call high risk, high reward. You either come away with as much as you can possibly walk away with, or you get nothing at all. Now, by comparison, let's see what happens if you choose to hunt the hare. Now, here's where game theory gets interesting. If you choose to hunt the hare, you'll notice that now it doesn't really matter what the other hunter chooses to do, because you are always going to walk away with something. It's either going to be 2 units of meat, if both of you choose to hunt the hare, in which case you split the reward, or you get 4 units of meat all to yourself, which is really not bad considering it's only 2 units less than your best possible outcome. So here is what game theory seeks to reveal to us. What is your best choice to make here? Or what is the optimal move? Well, in this scenario, that's obviously deciding to prepare to hunt the hare. Now, obviously, things start getting a lot more complicated than that the more moving parts you decide to add to it, but that is the heart of game theory. So how does that apply to poker? Well, poker is nothing if not a game of choices. Do you raise with your strong hand, or do you slow play it and try to trap your opponent? Do you call that big bet with top pair, thinking that maybe you're ahead or your opponent's bluffing, or do you fold and wait for a better opportunity? Do you chase the flush or let it go? While there are an awful lot of moving parts in poker, everything boils down to having a simple choice of actions. Check, bet, raise, or fold. Well, sadly with poker, you're never going to have a truly optimal decision like you are with the hare and the stag. There is no move that's always going to guarantee you a positive outcome. But you can use game theory to try and figure out what the optimal play is likely to be. And let me see if I can give you some examples. Let's say you've just flopped the nuts. Hooray, good for you. You are in a position where you are almost certainly going to win the hand. So the real trick then becomes, how do you get paid the maximum? Because really that's what it's all about, right? After all, flopping quads or a straight flush really isn't all that impressive if you only win a tiny little pot with it. It's not enough to simply have a super strong hand. No, you want to get paid as much as you possibly can with it. So, what is the optimal move that you can make in order to make that happen? Well, of course, that answer is going to be different with every possible scenario. It depends on how aggressive the people left in the hand with you are. It depends on what kind of table image you have. It depends on how big your stack is and how much clout you have with it. But using all of that information that's available to you, that if you're a decent poker player, you should be gathering the whole time you're sitting there, you should be able to narrow it down to some finite choices and then determine what the optimal choice is. So let's make it really specific. Let's say that you were in middle position and everybody folded to you until it was your turn to act and you have pocket nines. Now in this particular tournament, let's suppose you've been playing pretty tight and you haven't had a decent hand in a while, so you've been doing a lot of folding. But you see a good opportunity here, so you decide to come in for a raise. Let's say our blinds are 1,000 and 2,000, and you decide to bet 3 times the big blind, so 6,000. You get called by one player who just so happens to be on the button, and everybody else folds. And here comes the flop, and glory be, the other 2 nines come out. You just flopped 4 of a kind. I know this is kind of like the fantasy world example here, but believe it or not, this did just happen to me a week ago. And if you play long enough, it'll happen to you too. But while this seems like this is the best possible scenario, your work is not done. Because how do you proceed from here? How do you get paid the maximum? Well, a good place to start, I think, is to try and figure out what you know about the opponent who's in the hand with you. What kind of information have you gathered about them so far? Do they have a big stack or a short stack? Are they more aggressive or passive? Do they like to take the betting lead? Have they been making a lot of loose calls? Well, depending on how you answer all of these questions you have, that can help you narrow down the choices that you can now make. What is the optimal move? Do you just check here and hope that they bet into you? Do you put in a continuation bet that's made to look like you're just trying to steal the pot away because you had the betting lead, say another 6,000, the exact same bet you made before the flop? Do you make a really, really big bet to try and make it look like you don't want your hand to get cracked? Well, some of these decisions are also going to depend on a lot more information, like what is the size of your chip stack? Do you have some kind of a read on your opponent? What is the optimal play to make? Well, unfortunately, dear listeners, I'm not going to give you the answer to that. Because after all, as I said, there is no one answer that's going to solve all your problems in poker. Now, in this scenario, you can take some comfort in knowing that you're going to win this hand no matter what you choose to do. We're just looking for the optimal play, based on what you know. And of course, this is a really rare scenario, so let me see if I can give you an example of something that's a little bit more common in the game. Let's take a hand that a lot of people might consider a trouble hand, like Ace-King. Now, Ace-King shouldn't be considered a trouble hand. Mathematically and statistically speaking, it is one of the strongest starting hands. Even so, there are a great many people, especially at the low and no stakes level that I typically play in, that have a great deal of trouble playing this hand. A lot of people are afraid of it. I hear all kinds of people complain about it. And it's mostly because people seem to have a hard time winning with it. Now, this could be the result of a confirmation bias. You've lost with it so much that you're convinced it's a bad starting hand, or that it's just going to get you in trouble. But that's usually a belief that's based on the outcomes that you've had, not necessarily the reality of the situation. And I think the reason this happens is that a lot of people aren't necessarily playing it well. And I'll give you the most extreme example I can think of that comes straight from the pages of a league I played in years ago in a tavern. Now, this was a bar I had not played in before, and it was a league I played in well before the one I'm currently involved in. But very quickly in this tournament that I got myself into, I noticed that this was an incredibly loose room. Everybody at every table was very keen on making sure they saw a flop. And when everybody wants to call to see a flop, because, they're just gambling, and they're not risking anything to do it, what they very quickly realize is if it costs a whole lot to see a flop, people are going to end up busting out really quick because they commit so many chips that they can't get away from it. So people adjust over time, and you'll end up seeing something that is very, very common in free poker, which is a whole lot of people just limping in or calling the big blind to see a flop, and then trying to get as far as they can for as cheaply as they can so they can get to a showdown and everybody can turn their cards over to see who won. Well, strategically, this often doesn't make for very good poker. Case in point in this one hand that I was witness to. We are at the 200-400 level, or the second level of the entire tournament. I am seated in a middle position, and the action goes something like this. There is a small raise from the player who is under the gun, or first to act. And by small, I mean it's the minimum. The blinds are 200 and 400, they made it 800 to go. The next person to act called for 800. The next person to act called for 800. The next person to act, being me, takes a look at his cards, realizes they're not very good, and folds. The next 3 players at the table all call for 800, leaving the player on the button, who looks at his cards, seems to think for a very long time, and then calls for 800. Now getting offered incredible pot odds to call with any 2 cards, the small blind decides they're going to call the bet as well. And the big blind, already in for 400, says, hey, why not? And throws in another 400, and a whopping 8 people go to the flop, yours truly being the only one who decided not to play. The flop is the very definition of junk. The cards are low, they are all unconnected, it's 3 different suits. There is nothing exciting going on at all. And at that point, the action goes like this. Check, 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 check. Which brings us to the button, who looks at the board for a long time, looks at all the players in the hand, looks down at his hand again, and then checks. We go to a turn. The turn does not seem to improve anything at all. Now we have all 4 suits developing, so it's impossible to hit a flush. A straight could be possible, but is incredibly unlikely, and there's still nothing even remotely resembling a truly high card. Once again, 7 players check. The player on the button, once again, hems and haws for a little bit, and finally checks. And that brings us to the river, where one of the most baffling things I have ever witnessed at a poker tournament happens. The river is a deuce of clubs, the very definition of a brick. The small blind, having simply limped in for an additional 600, seeing all the money that could be won, suddenly decides to shove all in for 15,000. And the action goes like this. Fold, 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 fold. And we're on the button once again, who sits and thinks, and thinks, and thinks, and finally calls. When the button calls, he turns over ace-king. Big slick. He has nothing. He has ace-high with a king kicker, and he just called off all of his chips. The player who shoved all in turns over 9 deuce off suit and decided to go all in, sensing all that weakness and having paired the deuce on the river. The player in the small blind then proceeds to drag in an enormous pot, while the player who just busted out with ace-king stands up from the table in frustration and walks away grumbling about how he never wins with Big Slick. Not really too difficult to see what went wrong there, and I remembered thinking at the time, well, of course you didn't win with Big Slick, you didn't even play it. This is a pure example of someone just gambling and then being frustrated that a hand that's supposed to be one of the best starting hands didn't win. But good starting hands, it should be noted, can't win on their own. You still have to play them properly. You still have to navigate the field. You still have to manipulate the situation. You still have to make choices. By simply checking it all the way down, especially when he had position on everybody else at the table, he decided to not make any choices. You can't figure out what the optimal move is if you refuse to make any decisions. So if you happen to find yourself in that position, if you happen to find that you're holding ace-king, and there's that kind of action ahead of you, try and sit for a moment and think about what is the optimal play there. Well, ace-king is an excellent starting hand. Statistically speaking, if you pair one of your two cards, you're going to have the best possible pair, and if you hit nothing at all, you might still just win on the basis of having the highest card with the best kicker. But with that many people involved in the hand, it is actually closer to a statistical impossibility that nobody's going to hit anything at all. And if the person who hits their cards isn't you, then it doesn't matter how pretty that ace-king looks, you're going to lose the hand. So you need to figure out how to make sure that you are in the position that you want to be in, that your hand is the one that's got the best chance of winning. That means if you find yourself with ace-king in a late position with that many limpers, you've got to re-raise. Or, if you really don't feel like playing, you could always fold. Now, if you're in late position with ace-king, well, I think most of the experts in the world are going to tell you it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to fold there. You're blowing one of your best possible opportunities. But it is still one of the choices you can make. So what are your choices there? In this scenario, it got raised once for the bare minimum and called by all but one person ahead of you. So with that knowledge, and the knowledge that everybody is playing very, very passively but really wants to see a flop, what are the options available to you? What choices can you make? Well, as I just said, you could fold, which we've already agreed is not the best option. You can re-raise, which presents you with a couple more choices, namely, how much? Or you can do what the player in this example did, and just call. Based on the fact that folding there means you're not winning anything, although admittedly you're also not losing anything either, and knowing that simply calling there ultimately led to the terrible result that he had, it is fairly obvious that the optimal play here is to raise. And it probably doesn't have to be all that much. It's possible that it only needs to be in the same amount that was initially made. Take it up to 1,200. Or an even better idea, double the bet size from the original raiser, make it 16. In a game like this where everybody's playing really loose and knows that they're just using Monopoly money and they can go home knowing they didn't lose any money, you're still likely going to get some people to call. But do you really think the guy holding 9-deuce offsuit in the worst possible position is going to be one of those players? Raising here means you get to do a lot of different things. 1, you have an opportunity to narrow the field by giving people their choice to fold, which some of them are most likely going to take. Even if it's just half of the people who are involved in that hand, that's a lot of hands you no longer have to worry about. Secondly, it builds a pot that is more appetizing for you to try and win with your ace-king, which will help guide your decisions later in the hand. And, perhaps most importantly, it gives you the betting lead going into the flop when you are seated in the best position. Seeing how passively everybody played that hand, the person who goes in with the betting lead, if they're willing to make a continuation bet there, they're very often going to be the one to take that hand down. Remember, the player who had ace-king in that hand was on the button and didn't raise. The person who raised under the gun was the one who went to the flop with the betting lead. Now, interestingly enough, they chose not to continue either. They just checked it to the river. It sort of begs the question, what were they raising with to begin with? How would that hand have played out differently if the person who had the betting lead had decided to make a continuation bet there? A lot of those players probably would have folded. Maybe even the player with ace-king, although, judging by the way that hand went down, probably not. But imagine what happens in that hand if ace-king raises there. Maybe half the people drop out before the flop? Everybody still checks to him? He bets again? Maybe more people drop out until there's only 1 or 2 people left? Chances go up exponentially that he's going to win that hand instead of losing all his chips by making a bafflingly bad call on the river. So in that scenario, of the possible choices he had, fold, call, or raise, arguably, the raise is the optimal play. Now, I said before, a lot of people think that game theory optimal is perhaps obsolete because it is exploitable. But it's important to know, and there is much debate about whether it's really obsolete, because after all, it's sort of a default method of playing. It's a great way of looking at things, of trying to quantify the choices that you have to make based on what is your best possible outcome. You should always have a goal in mind when you decide to play a hand. And the goal should probably be more than, I want to see a flop and see if my hand improves. So if you're going to play a hand, take the time to think it out. Figure out what choices are sitting in front of you that you can make, figure out what the best and worst outcomes of those choices could be, and then plan your play accordingly. Or, if you discover that you do have the ability to exploit some of your opponent's play, maybe you can convince one of the other players to hunt the stag with you. Or even more deviously, convince them you're going to hunt the stag, and then go for the hare. Of course, we've only just scratched the surface of game theory here. Digging any deeper would lead to a much longer conversation than I think we have time for here today, and it's a much more advanced discussion as well. So really the only thing I want to get you to keep in mind right now is the idea of using game theory to whittle down your choices. Try and break your decisions down into their lowest common denominators to make it easier for you. And just as an exercise, this is something that my friend John and I did recently. Just a little brain teaser. We were trying to figure out if there was any scenario where you would fold pocket aces pre-flop. Now, the idea of that to any seasoned poker player, or even any poker player who's played for just a little bit, that seems pretty absurd. Why would you ever fold the strongest possible starting hand before the flop? Just doesn't make any sense. Or does it? Well, let's whittle it down. Let's try and come up with a scenario where you might actually do it. Now keep in mind, if you're really into winning a tournament, not just making it into the money, not just leveling up in tavern rankings or whatever, if you're trying to win, folding pocket aces pre-flop, that's not something you ever really want to consider. But we thought about it. We thought about it long and hard, and we managed to come up with this. Let's assume that you are at the World Series of Poker, or any major poker event with a whole lot of people in it, a really high buy-in, and a huge payout. Furthermore, you've already been in this tournament for quite some time, and now you are on the bubble. There's still hundreds of players left, but only one more elimination until everyone makes a massive payday. And you really want that money. Let's say that the difference between outlasting one more person or going home with nothing could be something like $20,000. Furthermore, you do not have a really short stack, nor do you have a really large stack. You're somewhere in the middle. You're in that sort of nebulous range where you're not desperate to try and increase your stack size so that you can survive, and you're also not so highly chipped up that you could just fold your way into the money easily. You're in that spot where you want to protect your stack. You want to try and abuse the other mid-range stacks, but you don't want to do it carelessly. The tables left in the tournament are all in hand-for-hand play. That means there's only one hand playing at a time in all of the tables left in the tournament. And keep in mind, you only have to outlast one more player. And while hand-for-hand play is going on, the hand arrives at your table. Meaning your table is the only table playing any hand right now. And it's going to continue that way, going from table to table to table, hand to hand, until someone gets eliminated. That's so they can track exactly what place everyone came in, and they can figure out who went on the bubble and how many people left get paid. And on this hand that happens at your table, you are in middle position, someone goes all in front of you, another player goes all in over the top of that, and then a third player calls the all in. So, it gets to you, and you have pocket aces, and calling would be a decision for all of your chips. That is the scenario that we came up with where it's actually okay to fold them. Realistically, you don't even look at your hand there. You don't have to worry about whether you have pocket aces or not because you know you're not going to call. You just have to outlast one person, and it's extremely likely that someone is going out in this hand. With multiple all-ins in front of you, and only one elimination to go, where the difference between going out next and surviving just one more person is thousands of dollars. I think I don't even look at my 2 cards there. I think I just throw them right in the muck. If you want to torture yourself, sure, you can look at it. Take a look at the pocket aces that you'd be throwing away. Or you could make that really high-risk, high-reward decision and get it all in, and hope that your hand holds up against 3 other people, knowing that only one person is going to win that hand, and the next person out goes home with nothing. It's not really a game theory situation so much, but it was an interesting exercise, I think, to whittle down your choices and try and make it as specific as possible, because what you might just find is that the optimal decision is not the one you automatically assumed was the correct one. I'm Steve Wannall, your poker guru. This has been the Tavern Poker Podcast. If you like what you hear, give me a like, share it with your friends, and even better, go out and play some poker. Find yourself a tavern league to compete in, or maybe a low-stakes game, or just invite your friends to come over and play on the kitchen table. Or if you are looking to follow some more Tavern Poker action, you can check out the live stream of World Tavern Poker live from Brews and Q's in Glen Burnie, Maryland, of which I am an assistant tournament director, frequent player, and commentator on the live stream. Until next time, this is Steve Wannall, you've been listening to the Tavern Poker Podcast, and I'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening.